The morning sun barely penetrated the tall windows of Chicago's Municipal Court building as people shuffled into courtroom 304. It was 8:45 a.m., and the wooden benches were already filling up with nervous faces. Judge William Thorne's reputation made everyone anxious, especially on Monday mornings. At 62 years old, Judge Thorne carried himself with the stern authority of someone who had spent 30 years behind the bench. His silver hair was always perfectly combed, and his black robe pressed without a single wrinkle. The court officers often whispered that he ironed it himself every morning. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom exactly at 9 o'clock a.m. Judge Thorne walked in, his face already set in its usual frown. He didn't like Mondays, and everyone knew it. "Be seated," he said without looking up, his voice carrying the weight of someone who expected immediate obedience. The shuffling of feet and rustling of clothes filled the room as people sat down. Among those waiting was Sarah Washington. She sat quietly in the middle row, dressed in simple blue jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and comfortable sneakers. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore no makeup or jewelry. Next to her, people clutched their tickets and paperwork, but Sarah only had her phone and a small parking ticket in her hands. The morning proceeded like clockwork. Judge Thorne handled case after case, his mood growing worse with each person who stepped forward. He gave no one more than 2 minutes to explain themselves. His sentences were harsh. Maximum fines for minor violations, no mercy for late payments. Case number 47 called out the court clerk. Sarah Washington, parking violation on Michigan Avenue. Sarah stood up gracefully, her movements calm and controlled. As she walked toward the front of the courtroom, an old lady sitting nearby whispered, "Poor dear, she picked a bad day to face old Thorne." Judge Thorne didn't even look up when Sarah reached the podium. He was too busy writing something in his notebook, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. "Ms. Washington," he said, still not looking up, "you parked in a loading zone for 45 minutes on Thursday afternoon. Do you deny this charge?" "Your Honor, if I may explain the circumstances," Sarah began, her voice clear and professional. "It's a simple question." Judge Thorne cut her off, finally looking up. His eyes narrowed slightly when he saw her. "Do you deny parking in a clearly marked loading zone, yes or no?" The courtroom was silent. Everyone could feel the tension building. Judge Thorne's treatment of minorities was well known in Chicago, though no one had ever successfully complained about it. "No, Your Honor, I don't deny it," Sarah replied calmly. However, there were extenuating circumstances that day. "There are no extenuating circumstances for breaking the law, Ms. Washington." Judge Thorne interrupted again. His voice carried that special tone he reserved for certain defendants, condescending and harsh. Sarah stood straight, her expression remaining neutral despite the judge's obvious bias. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on her, some with pity, others with understanding. The young court clerk, Jenny Martinez, watched the scene with growing discomfort. She had been working in this courtroom for 6 months and had seen this pattern too many times. A $50 ticket would become $500 for some defendants, while others would get away with a warning. The fine for parking in a loading zone is typically $100, Judge Thorne announced, shuffling some papers on his desk. However, given the length of time and he paused, looking at Sarah's casual clothes with obvious disapproval, lightened disregard for business operations in the area, "I'm setting the fine at $2,500. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Even the bailiff, who had seen Judge Thorne's harsh sentences before, raised his eyebrows at the excessive amount. Sarah didn't flinch. She stood there perfectly still, her face showing no reaction to the outrageous fine. The only movement was her right hand, which calmly reached for her phone. Little did Judge William Thorne know that this ordinary Monday morning was about to become the most memorable day of his 30-year career, and Sarah Washington was about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. Sarah Washington held her phone steadily as she pulled up her banking app. Judge Thorne watched her with a mix of impatience and satisfaction, expecting her to plead for more time to pay the unfair fine. "Your Honor." Sarah spoke clearly, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "Before I pay this fine, I'd like to understand why the amount is 25 times the standard penalty." Judge Thorne's face reddened slightly. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by defendants. "Ms. Washington, This court's decisions are not up for debate. If you can't pay the fine today, we can discuss a payment plan. The condescending smile on his face made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. Jenny Martinez, the court clerk, began typing faster than usual, making sure to record every word of the exchange. "That won't be necessary, Your Honor," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm simply trying to understand the legal basis for such a large increase. Is there something specific in my case that warrants this exceptional fine?" The judge's smile disappeared. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on his desk. "Are you questioning my authority, Ms. Washington?" "Not at all, Your Honor. I'm questioning the reasoning behind your decision." Sarah's voice remained respectful but firm. "As a citizen, don't I have the right to understand why I'm being fined $2,500 for a standard parking violation?" A few whispers spread through the courtroom. The bailiff, Officer Thompson, watched the exchange with growing interest. In his 15 years working this courtroom, he had never seen anyone challenge Judge Thorne so calmly and professionally. "Young lady," Judge Thorne's voice took on an even more patronizing tone, "perhaps you don't understand how things work here. This is my courtroom, and I decide the appropriate penalties based on the circumstances." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "And what circumstances led to this decision, Your Honor? Is there something in my driving record that concerns you?" Judge Thorne shuffled through the papers in front of him, knowing full well that Sarah's record was clean. His face grew redder as he realized she was backing him into a corner. "Ms. Washington, your attitude is not helping your case," he warned, trying to regain control of the situation. "I could increase the fine further for contempt of court." The threat hung in the air, but Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled out her reading glasses and put them on. "Your Honor, I've been nothing but respectful. I'm simply exercising my right to understand the judicial process. Would you mind if I took notes?" She pulled out a small notebook from her back pocket. The simple action somehow made Judge Thorne more uncomfortable than any angry outburst could have. "What exactly are you writing?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Just documenting today's proceedings, Your Honor. The time, date, the original violation, and your specific reasons for increasing the fine so dramatically." She looked up at him with genuine curiosity. "Would you like me to read back what you've stated so far?" The courtroom was now completely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers had stopped. Everyone watched as Judge Thorne's face went from red to almost purple. "This is highly irregular," he sputtered, picking up his gavel. "I will not have you disrupting my courtroom with these theatrics." "I'd apologize if asking for clarity seems disruptive, Your Honor," Sarah replied, still writing in her notebook. "I'm simply creating a record of this interaction. I'm sure the court keeps similar records, correct?" She glanced meaningfully at Jenny Martinez, who was still typing everything diligently. Judge Thorne suddenly noticed Jenny's rapid typing and shot her a sharp look. The young clerk pretended not to notice, keeping her eyes fixed on her computer screen. "Enough." Judge Thorne banged his gavel. "Pay the fine or face additional penalties. This is your final warning, Ms. Washington." Sarah closed her notebook slowly and placed it back in her pocket. "Of course, Your Honor. I'll pay the fine right now." She tapped a few buttons on her phone. "Would you like the receipt sent to the court's email, or should I have my office deliver a hard copy?" Something about the way she said "my office" made Judge Thorne pause. For the first time that morning, he felt a slight twinge of uncertainty. Who exactly was this woman in simple clothes who took such careful notes and spoke about her office? He was about to find out, and the answer would shake the foundations of his carefully controlled courtroom. While Sarah was completing the payment on her phone, Jenny Martinez, the court clerk, was scrolling through her own device during a brief pause in the proceedings. Her eyes suddenly widened. She had been sure Sarah Washington looked familiar, and now she knew why. "Oh my God," Jenny whispered to herself, quickly showing her phone to the bailiff beside her. Officer Thompson's mouth fell open slightly as he looked at the Forbes magazine article on Jenny's screen. The headline read, "Sarah Washington, the brilliant mind behind Washington Tech Solutions. How this self-made billionaire is changing the future." The bailiff quickly wrote a note and walked it up to Judge Thorne's bench. The judge, still looking smugly at Sarah, barely glanced at the note at first. Then his eyes darted back to it, and all the color drained from his face. Ms. Washington, he said, his voice suddenly much softer, there seems to be a small confusion here. Sarah looked up from her phone, having just completed the payment. No confusion at all, Your Honor. The $2,500 fine has been paid in full. She smiled politely. Would you like to see the confirmation? By now, Jenny's discovery was spreading through the courtroom in whispers. People were pulling out their phones, searching for Sarah Washington's name. The quiet buzz of excitement grew as more people realized who was standing before them. That's her. The AI company founder? She's worth billions. I saw her on TV last week. Judge Thorne's hands were shaking slightly as he removed his reading glasses. The woman standing before him wasn't just any defendant. She was Sarah Washington, the founder and CEO of Washington Tech Solutions, one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the world. Her company had recently made headlines for developing groundbreaking artificial intelligence systems that were revolutionizing healthcare. Ms. Washington, Judge Thorne cleared his throat. Perhaps we should discuss this matter in my chambers. Sarah checked the time on her phone. I don't think that's necessary, Your Honor. The fine has been paid. She paused, looking directly at him. Unless there's something else you'd like to discuss. Perhaps the reasoning behind the increased fine amount. The judge's forehead was now covered in small beads of sweat. The same woman he had been treating condescendingly moments ago was regularly meeting with world leaders and had more money than he could earn in 1,000 lifetimes. A young intern from the back of the courtroom rushed forward, holding a newspaper. Ms. Washington, I'm sorry to interrupt, but would you mind signing this? Your article about improving access to technology in underprivileged communities was inspiring. Before Sarah could respond, more people in the courtroom began speaking up. My daughter got one of your STEM scholarships. Your company's medical AI saved my mother's life. I use your app every day. Judge Thorne sat frozen in his chair, watching as his courtroom transformed into an impromptu fan meeting. Sarah handled the attention with grace, smiling kindly but maintaining her professional demeanor. Thank you all, she said quietly, but we should respect the court's proceedings. She turned back to Judge Thorne. Your Honor, since my case is concluded, may I be excused? The judge could only nod, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. But Sarah wasn't finished. One more thing, Your Honor, she said, pulling out her notebook again. I noticed some interesting patterns in today's proceedings. My legal team will be reviewing the court records from your previous sessions. We believe in equal justice for everyone, regardless of their appearance or social status. The message was clear. Judge Thorne's face turned pale as he realized the implications. Sarah Washington had the resources and influence to examine every decision he'd ever made from the bench. Have a good day, Your Honor, Sarah said, turning to leave. As she walked toward the door, she stopped by Jenny's desk. Ms. Martinez, thank you for your diligent record-keeping today. Expect a call from my office. We might need copies of today's transcripts. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Sarah Washington, dressed in her simple jeans and t-shirt, walked out with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the entire proceeding. Behind her, she left a shaken judge, an impressed audience, and the beginning of what would become a major investigation into judicial bias in the Chicago court system. Judge William Thorne's Monday was far from over, and his problems were just beginning. By noon that same day, Judge William Thorne sat alone in his chambers, staring at his computer screen. News of the morning's events had spread like wildfire through social media. A video clip someone had recorded in the courtroom was already going viral. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Local news stations wanted comments. The chief judge of the circuit court had left 3 messages. Even his wife had called, having seen the story on Facebook. A knock on his door made him jump. Come in, he said weakly. Jenny Martinez entered with a stack of papers. Sir, these just came from Ms. Washington's office. They're requesting records of all your cases from the past 5 years. She placed the official-looking documents on his desk. They're particularly interested in cases involving traffic violations and fine amounts. Judge Thorne loosened his collar. The room suddenly felt very hot. All of them? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, sir, and... Jenny hesitated. Channel 5 News is outside the courthouse. They're interviewing people from this morning's session. Outside the courthouse, Sarah Washington was sitting in her Tesla, making phone calls. Her simple t-shirt and jeans hadn't changed, but somehow she now looked different to everyone who passed by. Her true power wasn't in her clothes or appearance, it was in her actions. James, she spoke to her head lawyer through the car's speaker system. I want a full investigation. Not just Judge Thorne's records, but every judge in this circuit. Look for patterns in fines, sentencing, and treatment based on race, appearance, or perceived social status. Already on it, James replied. We got a team of data analysts starting today. The preliminary numbers from Judge Thorne's last 100 cases already show some disturbing patterns. Sarah nodded, even though James couldn't see her. Good. Also, contact the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Send them everything we find. As she ended the call, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Judge Thorne's office, requesting a private meeting. Sarah smiled slightly and typed a response. Any meeting will need to be on record, with our legal team present. Meanwhile, back in the courthouse, the morning's other defendants were sharing their stories with reporters. The old lady who had whispered, "Poor dear," when Sarah approached the bench was now enthusiastically describing the scene to a news crew. You should have seen his face, she told the reporter, when he found out who she was. Oh my. But the best part was how calm she stayed. Such dignity, such class. Judge Thorne watched the coverage from his window, his hands shaking as he poured himself a glass of water. 30 years on the bench, and he'd never faced anything like this. His secretary buzzed in. Sir, the chief judge wants to see you immediately. Walking down the courthouse hallway, Judge Thorne noticed how people looked at him differently now. The same courthouse staff who used to scramble out of his way now watched him pass with barely hidden smirks. In the chief judge's office, the atmosphere was tense. Chief Judge Patricia Rodriguez didn't offer him a seat. Bill, she said, using his first name for the first time in years, do you have any idea what kind of storm you've created? Sarah Washington isn't just any billionaire. She's one of the most influential advocates for social justice in the tech world. Her company's AI systems are used by half the civil rights organizations in the country. Judge Thorne slumped in his chair. I didn't know who she was, he muttered. That's exactly the problem. Chief Judge Rodriguez snapped. You shouldn't treat anyone differently based on who they are, rich or poor, famous or unknown. That's basic judicial ethics. As if things couldn't get worse, his secretary rushed in without knocking. Sir, Ms. Washington's team just filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Inquiry Board. They're calling for a complete review of your conduct on the bench. Judge Thorne's world was crumbling around him. The same authority he had wielded so carelessly for years was now being turned against him, and it all started because he couldn't see past his own prejudices. Outside, Sarah Washington's Tesla pulled away from the courthouse. She had achieved what she came for, not just paying an unfair fine, but exposing a system that needed change. The real work was just beginning. 1 week after the courtroom incident, Sarah Washington's legal team had taken over a whole floor of their downtown Chicago office building. 20 data analysts sat at computers, going through thousands of court records. The walls were covered with charts and graphs showing Judge Thorne's sentencing patterns. James Chen, Sarah's chief lawyer, stood in front of a large screen presenting the findings to Sarah. It's worse than we thought, he said, pointing to a colored graph. In the last 5 years, Judge Thorne gave minorities fines that were, on average, 300% higher than those given to white defendants for the same violations. Sarah, now dressed in a simple business suit, studied the numbers carefully. What about jail time for similar offenses? James clicked to the next slide. Even more disturbing. African American defendants were 4 times more likely to get jail time instead of probation. Hispanic defendants, 3 times more likely. The door opened, and Jenny Martinez walked in. After the incident, she had quit her job as court clerk and joined Sarah's team as a key witness. More people are coming forward, she announced, holding up a stack of papers. I got 50 new testimonies from previous defendants. Sarah turned to face the room full of workers. Remember everyone, this isn't just about Judge Thorne anymore. We're looking at the entire system. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Thorne was facing his own crisis. He sat in a meeting room with 3 members of the Judicial Inquiry Board. The local news had been running stories about him all week, showing old footage of him in court, interviewing former defendants. Judge Thorne, one board member said, We've reviewed the initial evidence. Can you explain why a simple parking ticket resulted in a $2,500 fine for Ms. Washington? Thorne wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. I was having a bad day, he stammered. A bad day? Another board member raised her eyebrows. We found hundreds of cases where you gave unusually harsh sentences. Were you having a bad day for the past 5 years? Before he could answer, his lawyer whispered something in his ear. The truth was, Judge Thorne had never thought anyone would actually check his records. He had felt untouchable in his courtroom for so long. Back at Washington Tech Solutions, Sarah was meeting with civil rights leaders from across the city. The conference room was packed with community activists, religious leaders, and local politicians. What we found in Judge Thorne's courtroom isn't unique, Sarah explained, showing them the data. But we can use this case to push for real change. Reverend Jackson, a longtime civil rights activist, nodded in agreement. This is the evidence we've needed for years. But Ms. Washington, taking on the entire judicial system will make you some powerful enemies. Sarah smiled. I didn't build a billion-dollar company by avoiding challenges, Reverend. Besides, what's the point of having resources if we don't use them to fix broken systems? The investigation was making waves beyond Chicago. National news networks picked up the story. Other cities started looking at their own court records. Sarah's team received calls from civil rights organizations across the country, all wanting to use her data analysis methods to examine their local courts. That evening, Sarah sat in her office, looking out over the Chicago skyline. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jenny. Judge Thorne just announced he's taking a leave of absence. Sarah hadn't wanted to destroy the judge's career. Her goal was bigger. She wanted to change the system that had allowed him to abuse his power for so long. Her assistant walked in with more files. Ms. Washington, we found something interesting. Judge Thorne isn't the worst offender in the circuit. There are 3 other judges whose numbers are even more biased. Sarah turned from the window. Send everything to James. And call another press conference for tomorrow morning. As night fell over Chicago, lights stayed on in the Washington Tech Solutions building. The team worked late, knowing they were part of something important. They weren't just exposing one biased judge anymore, they were shining a light on decades of systematic discrimination. Judge Thorne had unknowingly picked the wrong person to discriminate against that Monday morning. His $2,500 fine was about to cost the broken system much more than money. It was about to cost them their comfort in operating in the shadows. 2 months after the courtroom incident, the Chicago Community Center was packed. People stood along the walls, sat in the aisles, and crowded the doorways. Sarah Washington stood on the stage, speaking to over 500 people who had been unfairly treated in traffic court. Today, we're launching the Fair Justice Initiative, Sarah announced, her voice clear and strong. This program will provide free legal help to anyone who believes they've been treated unfairly in traffic court. But that's just the beginning. In the front row, Jenny Martinez sat with her laptop, documenting everything. Behind her, a group of law students wore T-shirts with Justice for All printed on them. They were part of the new volunteer program Sarah had started. Every person who walks into a courtroom deserves to be treated with respect, Sarah continued. It shouldn't matter what they're wearing, what color their skin is, or how much money they have in their bank account. The crowd erupted in applause. Among them was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who had recently gotten help from Sarah's team. The judge had fined her $1,000 for a broken taillight. Sarah's lawyers had gotten the fine reduced to $50, the standard amount. At the back of the room, news cameras rolled. This wasn't just a Chicago story anymore. People across the country were watching. We've already helped 300 people appeal unfair fines, Sarah said, pointing to a large screen behind her. Together, these fines added up to over $500,000, money that was taken unfairly from our community. The screen showed photos of families who had gotten help. A single mother who had been fined $800 for parking in the wrong spot. A college student who got a $1,200 ticket for an expired meter. A retired teacher who had to pay $2,000 for missing a stop sign. But this isn't just about money, Sarah explained. It's about dignity. It's about justice. It's about changing a system that has been broken for too long. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Thorne's empty courtroom told its own story. Yellow sticky notes marked evidence were stuck to his bench. Investigators still came in regularly, checking records and taking photos. Back at the community center, Sarah introduced her next surprise. Today, we're announcing a new app. It's called Court Watch. Anyone can use it to record their experience in traffic court. The app will automatically analyze fine amounts and look for patterns of unfair treatment. The crowd murmured with excitement as volunteers began passing out phones with the app already installed. But that's not all, Sarah continued. Washington Tech Solutions is setting aside $50 million to help communities fight unfair court practices. This money will pay for lawyers, court fees, and investigations. No one should have to face an unfair system alone. In the audience, a young man named Marcus stood up. "Ms. Washington," he called out, his voice shaking slightly. "Last year, I lost my job because I couldn't pay a $500 traffic fine. It turned into $3,000 with late fees. I had to choose between paying the fine and buying food for my kids." Sarah nodded seriously. "Stories like yours are exactly why we're here, Marcus. I'm happy to tell you that our legal team will be helping you appeal those fines tomorrow morning." The room burst into applause again. People were crying, hugging each other, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment. Outside the community center, a small group of protesters had gathered. They held signs supporting Judge Thorne and the current system, but their voices were drowned out by the sounds of hope and change coming from inside. As the meeting ended, people lined up to sign up for legal help. Sarah stayed until the last person had been heard. It was nearly midnight when she finally left the community center. In her car, she checked her phone. There were messages from civil rights leaders in New York, Los Angeles, and Atlanta. They all wanted to start similar programs in their cities. Sarah smiled as she read the messages. What Judge Thorne had meant as punishment had turned into a movement. His unfair fine hadn't just exposed one biased judge. It had given hope to thousands of people who thought they had to face the system alone. The Fair Justice Initiative was just getting started, and Sarah Washington was ready to take the fight nationwide. 3 months after launching the Fair Justice Initiative, Sarah Washington sat in the main hearing room of the Illinois Judicial Board. The room was completely silent as Chief Investigator Robert Martinez presented his findings about Judge Thorne's conduct. After reviewing over 10,000 cases from the past 5 years, Robert said, pointing to the screen behind him, "We found clear evidence of systematic bias in Judge Thorne's courtroom." Judge Thorne sat at a table with his lawyers, looking much older than he had that Monday morning in traffic court. His hair had turned completely white, and his hands shook as he drank water from a paper cup. In cases involving minority defendants, Robert continued, fines were consistently 3 to 5 times higher than those given to white defendants for identical violations. This pattern was present in 92% of all cases reviewed. The board members took notes, their faces serious. One of them, Judge Patricia Chen, leaned forward. "And what about the specific incident with Ms. Washington?" Robert clicked to the next slide. On that day alone, Judge Thorne heard 27 cases. The average fine for white defendants was $125. For minorities, it was $750. Ms. Washington's $2,500 fine for a simple parking violation was the highest amount ever recorded in his court for such an offense. In the audience, Jenny Martinez sat with Sarah's legal team. She had brought all the original court records she had saved during her time as court clerk. Those records had become key evidence in the investigation. "Your Honor," Robert added, "we also found hundreds of complaints that were never investigated. Many people couldn't afford to appeal their fines, so they just paid them, often going into debt to do so." Judge Thorne's lawyer stood up to speak. "My client acknowledges that mistakes were made," he began, but Sarah's team immediately objected. "These weren't mistakes," James Chen argued, standing up. "This was a deliberate pattern of discrimination that lasted for years. It only came to light because Ms. Washington had the resources to challenge it." The hearing continued for hours. Outside the building, protesters held signs reading "Justice for All" and "End Court Bias." News vans lined the street, their cameras focused on the building's entrance. Finally, after 6 hours of testimony, the board reached their decision. The head of the board, Justice Maria Rodriguez, cleared her throat. "William Thorne," she announced formally, "this board finds clear and convincing evidence of judicial misconduct. You have violated the fundamental principles of fairness and equality that every judge must uphold." The room grew even quieter. Judge Thorne seemed to shrink in his chair. "Therefore, we order the following. First, your immediate removal from the bench. Second, all fines issued in your court over the past 5 years will be reviewed and, where appropriate, refunded. Third, you will surrender your law license pending further investigation." Cameras flashed as Judge Thorne's face turned pale. This wasn't just a suspension. His career was over. But Justice Rodriguez wasn't finished. Furthermore, this board is implementing mandatory bias training for all judges in the circuit. We are also establishing a citizen review board to monitor fine amounts and sentencing patterns in all traffic courts. Sarah nodded quietly. This was more than just punishment for one judge. It was real systemic change. After the hearing, reporters surrounded Judge Thorne as he left the building. "Do you have any comment about the board's decision?" they shouted. For the first time, Judge Thorne looked truly humbled. He paused, his voice breaking. "I never saw my own bias until it was shown to me in those numbers. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused." Later that evening, Sarah met with her team at their office. The walls were covered with new charts showing fine patterns from courts across the state. The Fair Justice Initiative was expanding, and similar investigations were starting in other cities. "Today's decision sets a precedent," James told the team. "Other judges will think twice before letting their biases affect their decisions." Sarah looked out at her tired but happy team. "This isn't about revenge," she said softly. "It's about making sure every person who walks into a courtroom gets the same fair treatment, regardless of who they are." As night fell over Chicago, the news of Judge Thorne's removal spread across social media. His story would be taught in law schools as a warning about the consequences of judicial bias. But more importantly, his case had opened the door for real change in America's justice system. 6 months after Judge Thorne's removal from the bench, the Chicago traffic court looked very different. New signs in multiple languages explained people's rights. A help desk staffed by law students helped people understand their tickets. And most importantly, every courtroom had a large digital display showing the average fines for each type of violation. Sarah Washington stood at the back of courtroom 304, the same room where her story had begun. But now, instead of Judge Thorne's stern face on the bench, Judge Maria Santos, a newly appointed judge, presided over cases with patience and respect. "Next case," Judge Santos called out, smiling at the nervous young man approaching the bench. She took time to explain his rights, listened to his explanation, and issued a fair fine based on the published guidelines. In the courthouse hallway, a familiar face approached Sarah. It was William Thorne, the former judge, looking much older and humbler than before. He had asked to meet with her through her office. "Ms. Washington," he said quietly, "thank you for agreeing to see me." They walked to a nearby conference room where Jenny Martinez and James Chen were waiting. Everything was still documented, just as it had been that first day. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Thorne began, his hands folded in his lap. "And more importantly, a lot of learning. The bias training program, it opened my eyes to things I never wanted to see in myself." Sarah listened quietly as he continued. "I've spent the last 3 months working with the Fair Justice Initiative, reviewing cases and helping identify other judges who showed patterns of bias," he explained. "It's my way of trying to make things right." Sarah nodded. "How has the experience been?" "Humbling," Thorne admitted. "Reading through those cases, seeing the impact of unfair fines on families. I realize now how much damage I did from that bench. One woman lost her home because she couldn't pay a fine I gave her. Another man missed his daughter's wedding because he was afraid of coming to court over a parking ticket." Tears formed in his eyes as he spoke. This wasn't the same arrogant judge who had tried to humiliate Sarah 6 months ago. "That's why I'm here today," he continued, pulling out some papers. "I'm starting a program to help former judges learn about their biases and work to fix the system they helped break. Would your initiative consider supporting it?" Sarah smiled. This was exactly the kind of change she had hoped for, not just punishing wrong actions, but transforming people and systems. "Send the proposal to James," she said. "We'll review it carefully." Later that afternoon, Sarah attended a ceremony at City Hall. The mayor was signing new legislation inspired by her case that set strict guidelines for traffic court fines and required regular audits of judicial decisions. Thanks to Ms. Washington's courage and resources, the mayor announced, Chicago now has the most transparent traffic court system in the nation. But we're not stopping there. The new law was named the Equal Justice Act, and other cities were already asking for help implementing similar reforms. Back at Washington Tech Solutions, Sarah met with her team one last time that day. The walls that once showed evidence of Judge Thorne's bias now displayed data from courts across the country. The Court Watch app had been downloaded millions of times, and people everywhere were using it to monitor their local courts. We've helped over 10,000 people appeal unfair fines, Jenny reported. And the new guidelines have prevented countless others from being unfairly charged in the first place. Sarah looked around at her team, lawyers, data analysts, community organizers, and volunteers. What had started as one woman standing up to an unfair fine had grown into a national movement for judicial reform. Remember that Monday morning? Jenny asked with a smile, when Judge Thorne thought you couldn't afford the fine. Sarah laughed softly. Sometimes the best way to fight injustice is to let it reveal itself. He never asked what I did for a living. He just saw what he wanted to see. As she prepared to leave for the day, Sarah received one last piece of news. The National Judicial Council had adopted her team's guidelines for fair fines, making them the standard across the country. A simple parking ticket had started it all, but thanks to Sarah Washington's courage, resources, and determination, millions of Americans would now face a fairer justice system. The billionaire in jeans had changed more than just one judge's courtroom. She had helped transform the entire system. And somewhere in Chicago, a former judge named William Thorne was teaching others about the importance of seeing people for who they really are, not what they appear to be.